The reading is Nehemiah chapters 1 and 2. The words of Nehemiah, son of Hakaliah, in the month of Kislev, in the 20th year, while I was in the citadel of Susa, Hanani, one of my brothers came from Judah with some other men, and I questioned them about the Jewish remnant that had survived the exile, and also about Jerusalem. They said to me, "Those who survived the exile and are back in the province are in great trouble and disgrace. The wall of Jerusalem is broken down, and its gates have been burned with fire." When I heard these things, I sat down and wept. For some days I mourned and fasted and prayed before the God of heaven. Then I said, "Lord, the God of heaven, the great and awesome God, who keeps his covenant of love with those who love him and keep his commandments, let your ear be attentive and your eyes open to hear the prayer your servant is praying before you day and night for your servants, the people of Israel. I confess the sins we Israelites, including myself and my father's family, have committed against you. We have acted very wickedly towards you. We have not obeyed the commands, decrees, and laws you gave your servant Moses. Remember the instruction you gave your servant Moses, saying, 'If you are unfaithful, I will scatter you among the nations. But if you return to me and obey my commands, then even if your exiled people are at the farthest horizon, I will gather them from there and bring them to the place I have chosen as a dwelling for my name. They are your servants and your people, whom you redeemed by your great strength and your mighty hand. Lord, let your ear be attentive to the prayer of this your servant, and to the prayer of your servants who delight in revering your name. Give your servant success today by granting him favor in the presence of this man." I was cupbearer to the king. In the month of Nisan, in the 20th year of King Artaxerxes, when wine was brought for him, I took the wine and gave it to the king. I had not been sad in his presence before, so the king asked me, "Why does your face look so sad when you are not ill? This can be nothing but sadness of heart." I was very much afraid, but I said to the king, "May the king live forever. Why should my face not look sad when the city where my ancestors are buried lies in ruins, and its gates have been destroyed by fire?" The king said to me, "What is it you want?" Then I prayed to the God of heaven, and I answered the king, "If it pleases the king, and if your servant has found favor in his sight, let him send me to the city in Judah where my ancestors are buried, so that I can rebuild it." Then the king, with the queen sitting beside him, asked me, "How long will your journey take, and when will you get back?" It pleased the king to send me, so I set a time. I also said to him, "If it pleases the king, may I have letters to the governors of Trans-Euphrates, so that they will provide me safe conduct until I arrive in Judah? And may I have a letter to Asaph, keeper of the royal park, so he will give me timber to make beams for the gates of the citadel by the temple, and for the city wall, and for the residence I will occupy?" And because the gracious hand of my God was on me, the king granted my requests. So I went to the governors of Trans-Euphrates and gave them the king's letters. The king had also sent army officers and cavalry with me. When Sanballat the Horonite and Tobiah the Ammonite official heard about this, they were very much disturbed that someone had come to promote the welfare of the Israelites. I went to Jerusalem, and after staying there 3 days, I set out during the night with a few others. I had not told anyone what my God had put in my heart to do for Jerusalem. There were no mounts with me except the one I was riding on. By night I went out through the valley gate towards the Jackal Well and the Dung Gate, examining the walls of Jerusalem, which had been broken down, and its gates, which had been destroyed by fire. Then I moved on towards the Fountain Gate and the King's Pool, but there was not enough room for my mount to get through, so I went up the valley by night, examining the wall. Finally, I turned back and re-entered through the valley gate. The officials did not know where I had gone or what I was doing, because as yet I had said nothing to the Jews or the priests, or nobles or officials, or any others who would be doing the work. Then I said to them, "You see the trouble we are in. Jerusalem lies in ruins, and its gates have been burned with fire. Come, let us rebuild the wall of Jerusalem, and we will no longer be in disgrace." I also told them about the gracious hand of my God on me and what the king had said to me. They replied, "Let us start rebuilding." So they began this good work. But when Sanballat the Horonite, Tobiah the Ammonite official, and Geshem the Arab heard about it, they mocked and ridiculed us. "What is this you are doing?" they asked. "Are you rebelling against the king?" I answered them by saying, "The God of heaven will give us success. We, his servants, will start rebuilding, but as for you, you have no share in Jerusalem or any claim or historic right to it."
Thanks, Beck, for that great reading, and a very long reading. I really appreciate it. And it's great to be with you and to be able to share with you today from the book of Nehemiah. I love the book of Nehemiah. I hope that you will come to love it if you don't love it already. It's a great book. It's a fantastic book. It's just not immediately obvious that it's a great book. Okay, so just first time you look at it, I think, probably just going, what's going on here? Why is this even meant to be interesting? How did this end up in the Bible? That kind of stuff. So those are reasonable questions to ask. And I hope over the next few weeks as we get into it, it'll be really helpful for you to come to love the book. As we heard mentioned, we're going to cover the whole book in Bible studies and talks combined. So we're not going to do every passage here at PBT, and not going to do every passage in Bible studies. So to get the full picture, you need to go to both. So hopefully you'll be able to do that as well, and that would be great. All right, so I want to just start off by thinking about how does this fit into the overall story of the Bible. So the Bible as a whole tells a story. It's got lots of different ways of telling the story. It's got lots of different books, lots of different kinds of literature. But together it tells one story. And so let's try and put Nehemiah in the story. And that's always what we're trying to do, I guess, as we read the Bible. I'm going to get an interesting effect here as we put this up. Okay. The Bible has a prologue to start with. And the prologue kind of introduces the issue, the problem. And the prologue is really Genesis 1 to 12 in the Bible. It tells the story. It sets up the scene by telling us the way that God made the world. God created a good world. His design for human beings, that we're made to know God, to be in relationship with each other and the world. And it tells the story of what went wrong, that human beings rejected God, rebelled against God, and through that we end up actually alienated from God, in trouble and disgrace with God, unable to properly manage the world and care for the world, in strife with each other, and in a negative relationship with God. So humans are portrayed in this part of the Bible as selfish and violent, exploiting, hurting, harming each other, rejecting God, in all kinds of trouble and in disgrace with God. And then the action of the Bible begins in Genesis chapter 12 with God calling Abraham. So this is where the story really begins and kicks in. And that's around 1800 BC. God says to Abraham, leave the land that you're in and go to the land that I will show you. And thank you. And he promises to Abraham that he will bless him, that he will multiply his descendants, that he'll give him the land to live in. And the ultimate goal is that the whole world will be blessed through Abraham's descendants. The whole world. So God is going to fix things up. He's going to bring blessing to the whole world through this man's family. That's the promise that he makes. And eventually, about 600 years later, the descendants of Abraham finally make it into the promised land. So to tell the story here, we need a timeline, and we need a map, and we need a picture as well. So it's going to get complicated. I hope that we'll just be able to keep it all together. All right. And so they go into the promised land. Here is a picture of the promised land, a map. Of the promised land. That is the land of Canaan, what we would today call Palestine and Israel. And the people led after receiving the law of Moses, go into the promised land and start to take possession of it. That's around 1200 BC. And they have trouble doing that. They struggle to do that, but eventually God gives them a great king, David, around the year 1000 BC. And David helps them to take possession of the land. And David captures or recaptures a city called Jerusalem, and he makes it his capital. And this city, pictured here for you, I'm a pretty good illustrator, aren't I? Was a city on a hill. It was a fortress city. And it was on a hill, and it was a walled city, and David captured it, he made it his capital, and he ruled over a fairly extensive kingdom in the promised land and going beyond in various directions. And what David did was he set things up so that it was he built his palace there. So let's do a palace. What do palaces look like? Okay. And even more important than that, he set things up for his son Solomon to build a great temple there. A great temple, a glorious temple where the people of Israel could meet together with God. And this was God's choice that he would put his name in Jerusalem, that this would be the place where people could come to worship the true God. Okay, so in some ways it's a high point in the story. After David and after Solomon, his son, first of all what happens is that the kingdom is divided into a northern and southern kingdom. And the southern kingdom, called Judah, still has its capital here at Jerusalem. The northern kingdom, called Israel, separates from it. Eventually that northern kingdom is destroyed and conquered by the Assyrians. And so the other thing that you've got going on in this story is you've always got some mega empire over on this eastern side, always threatening to destroy Israel. And so first of all, the Assyrians destroy the northern kingdom. But then the Assyrians are themselves destroyed by the Babylonians. And they become the mega empire here. And the Babylonians eventually capture Jerusalem and destroy it in the year 597. And so Jerusalem is destroyed. The people of Israel have rebelled against God, and God allows the Babylonians to come in and destroy the nation of Judah and the city of Jerusalem. So what happens? What do the Babylonians do? They destroy the temple completely. They destroy the city and its buildings. They burn the city and they break down the walls. And so this is the situation. You've got walls that are broken down. You've got some gates that used to be there that are now just wide open. The gates have been burned. And you've got just rubble and crap in the city. It's ugly. And the people are carried away into exile. The Babylonians just take the population away and transplant them in other places in their empire. But then the Babylonians themselves get trashed by the Persians, and the Persians create an even bigger empire, the biggest empire the world has ever seen, and that includes the conquered region of Canaan, and they call it the province beyond the river, or in our translation here, Trans-Euphrates, beyond the river. So the people of Israel are in a terrible situation here. They've been carried away, their city has been destroyed, and really at this point it wouldn't be surprising if the Jewish people just disappeared from history. And we know there are lots of nations and lots of empires and lots of cities at this time that just cease to exist. The populations are absorbed into other groups and they just no longer exist. And it looks like very much likely that this is going to happen with the people of Israel, that they've been taken away to other places, their city and their nation's been destroyed. There's very little likelihood that they will ever exist again. But then something surprising happens, and that is that the Persian king Cyrus in 538 announces that he's decided that any Jews who want to go back to Jerusalem and back to the land of Judah are allowed to go back. And he lets them go back. We're told that a bit over 40,000 of them return, so just a tiny fraction of the original population. And they're allowed to return to Jerusalem, and Cyrus says that they're allowed to rebuild the temple. So they go back there and they start to worship God, and they start to rebuild a beautiful temple. But the city is still broken down, and the gates are still destroyed, and the walls are still broken down as well. The place is just full of rubble. And that situation continues for a long time until Nehemiah comes on the scene, and we're talking about the year 445 or so. Okay. So it's been a long time. When Nehemiah gets there, it's been over 150 years since the city was destroyed. It's been essentially in ruins for a long, long time. And it's been a long time even since people started going back there and settling there again. Almost 100 years that they've been there, that the temple is there. There's an opportunity to worship God, but the city is entirely insecure, and no one really wants to live there because it's rubble, because it's unprotected. And it's a really difficult situation. All right. How do the people understand this situation? They understand it as a situation of disgrace. Let's have a look at the action of the book and how it works out. And we discover, first of all, that Nehemiah is in a city called Susa. And if we were to put that on the map, it would just be just miles away over here somewhere in the Persian Empire, part of modern-day Iran. I googled this because you can do that. I put in Susa and I put in Jerusalem. It's 1,500 plus kilometres away from each other, and they said it would be like a 23-hour drive. Though I don't like your chances of actually being able to drive from Susa to Jerusalem. But anyway, that's the kind of distance that it is, a journey of several weeks away. So Nehemiah is at the centre of Persian power, where the Persian court is, in Susa. He is a cupbearer to the king, and that means he's a kind of like a super servant. On one hand, it means he's a really significant and important person and privileged person, but on the other hand, he's also the king's servant, doing this kind of ceremonial servant role. And we don't know exactly what it consisted of, but it certainly puts him right at the very centre of power in the Persian Empire. And he tells us that one of his brothers, Hanani, arrived with news about the situation in Jerusalem. So we just need to remember that at this time, communication was really difficult. To get news from a place 1,500 kilometres away would be hard. And so Nehemiah just doesn't seem to know what is going on in Jerusalem. And so he gets news about it. And what he hears really upsets him. They said to me, verse 3, those who survived the exile and are back in the province are in great trouble and disgrace. The wall of Jerusalem is broken down and its gates have been burned with fire. And when I heard these things, I sat down and wept. For some days I mourned and fasted and prayed before the God of heaven. And this idea that the people are in disgrace is really emphasised for us, the trouble that they're in, because Nehemiah says it here, and then again in chapter 2, verse 17, that it's the disgrace of the city that he particularly is concerned about, and the trouble that the people are in, living in the ruins, living in a city that has no functioning wall and gates. And so he can see that the people are still not blessed by God. They're still under the condemnation of God. They're still bearing their guilt before God for the things that they've done. And so they're in disgrace before God, but they're also in disgrace before other people. That is, it's a shameful thing for them in front of the nations and the people around them that their city is still destroyed after all these years, and that they are so vulnerable to being attacked by others. And no one would want to live in this city in the state that it's in. So Nehemiah, he starts to pray and he asks God to change the situation. So I want you to notice a few things about Nehemiah's response. First of all, he really cares about what is going on with Jerusalem. He cares about it passionately. He's deeply upset when he hears the situation, and he wants it to change. And really at this point, he could have chosen a very different path. He could have said, well, that's a shame, but I'm comfortable here in Susa. I'm here in the Persian court. Things are great. I'm in favour. I'm able to get wealthy from this role that I have. Let's just forget about the whole Israel thing. That's the ancient history. That happened 150 years ago. Let's just leave it behind. That could easily have been his attitude. Persia is the future. Let's all go Persian, and let's just forget about the whole dream of the promised land. He could have said that, but no, he doesn't. He cares. He cares passionately about God and what's important to God. He sees himself as God's servant, and he refers to himself repeatedly as God's servant in the prayer, you'll notice. And so, as God's servant, he wants to carry out God's purposes. So he cares about it, and he sees himself as a servant in terms of fixing things up, making things right. But he doesn't just care, he is going to act. But first of all, he prays. And he prays, confessing his sins and the sins of the people of Israel. So he goes back to the problem. What is the source of this disgrace? The source of our disgrace is our rebellion against God, our sin. And so he confesses it. He admits that he's part of the problem and his family are part of the problem. He doesn't dodge. He doesn't blame anyone else. He owns the problem himself, and he asks for God's forgiveness. Then he reminds God of his promises, God's promises, that even if the people of Israel are scattered among the nations, as they have been, that if they return to God, then he will bring them back. So he talks about the promise that God made long before, and is now asking God to keep that promise. And finally, he prays that God will be with him as he asks for the king's help in fixing the situation. And only once he's done that, actually, does he go ahead and ask. And interestingly, he actually prays, "Give your servant success today in granting him favour in the presence of this man." So it seems like Nehemiah was anticipating that he was going to ask that very day, but actually it turns out to be several months later before he gets a chance to talk to the king. We don't know why, don't know what that was. Just interesting that God doesn't give him his exact request, but it takes quite a while until he's able to speak to the king. And so finally he gets up the courage to ask. And the way that he asks is, he appears before the king looking really sad. And apparently this is a total no-no. Right? Just do not do this. Next time you have to appear before a Persian king, you just keep a smile on your face, because that is what's expected. The king's not concerned with your stuff, your issues, whether you're feeling good or not. You're there to serve him. So don't appear looking sad. But Nehemiah takes the chance. He looks sad. The king's very perceptive. He says, it's not that you're sick, but that you've got a sickness of the heart. There's something really important going on. And apparently Nehemiah has enough favour with the king that he is able to then take a chance and just blurt out the problem, that he's so upset. Why should my face not look sad when the city where my ancestors are buried lies in ruins and its gates are destroyed by fire? And the king responds to this by asking him, what does he want? So God is answering the prayer. The king is responding favourably. Nehemiah tells us that he prayed again and answered the king, if it pleases the king, let him send me to the city in Judah where my ancestors are buried, so that I can rebuild it. So he asks for this. What he's really asking is to become the governor of Jerusalem, I think, and he uses that term later on in the letter. And the king's answer is fantastic. How long will your journey take, and when will you get back? This is the way that powerful people act when they want to show favour. They don't say yes, they say, so how long are you going to be gone? That kind of thing. The king is pleased with the request, and he lets Nehemiah go and become the governor, and he gives him everything that he needs in order to be able to do this. So it sounds like Nehemiah is going to become just the governor of Judah, the area around Jerusalem, and he's going to be underneath the authority of whoever's in charge of the province beyond the river. And there seem to be several officials doing that. So off he goes, and basically he just passes over the fact that he had to travel 1,500 kilometres to get to Jerusalem, because he straight away just says, so I went to the governors of Trans-Euphrates and gave them the king's letters. But really just covering up a journey of what must have been several weeks. The people in charge are unhappy, Sanballat and Tobiah, and Geshem we hear about later as well. They don't want Jerusalem to be rebuilt. They don't want another city that's going to rival their centres of power. And so they're really unhappy with what Nehemiah is going to do. And that's going to be a theme that's going to develop through the book as we read through. And what Nehemiah does is he has a look around. He arrives, he has 3 days rest, and then he goes out at night secretly to look around. So we've already got an atmosphere here of suspicion, and Nehemiah is trying to do stuff without drawing attention to what he's doing. He goes around the city at night, he has a look at the walls. It's perhaps the case that he's never been to Jerusalem before, and so he's trying to fix a city that he doesn't even know. He cares about it, but he doesn't necessarily know much about it. He tours around, he sees the way that the wall is broken down. He doesn't tell anyone what he's going to do, and then he shares his vision with the leaders in Jerusalem. Verse 17, you see the trouble we are in. Jerusalem lies in ruins, and its gates have been burned with fire. Come, let us rebuild the wall of Jerusalem, and we will no longer be in disgrace. And I also told them about the gracious hand of my God on me, and what the king had said to me. And they replied, let us start rebuilding. So they really respond positively when they hear what's been going on. Previously, the Persian kings had forbidden the walls to be rebuilt, but now Artaxerxes says, let the walls be rebuilt. And so they start work. They replied, let us start rebuilding. And so they began this good work. And we'll hear more next week about the rebuilding of the walls. Well, what is going on in these chapters and in this story? I think the way we would summarise it is this way, that what's happening here is that God is rescuing his people from trouble and disgrace. That's the way that their situation is framed in the story. They're in trouble and they're in disgrace. And what does God do? He rescues them from that situation by sending a person, a man, a servant, to save them, to rescue them from their situation. And so I think actually what we're seeing here in some ways is the most important story of the Bible, the story of Jesus, the story of Jesus coming into the world. We're seeing that story being acted out on a kind of smaller scale in advance. A kind of shadow, a sign of what is still to come in the story. That Nehemiah does for the people in Jerusalem, what Jesus does for the people of the world. And look, the way you think about this, I think might depend on the kind of question you ask, or the way you think about stories has to do, I think, with who you identify with in the story. So as you read this passage, who is it that you think that you're like? That's one of the questions. Who do you think you're like in the story? And, you know, if you're like me and you've got a bit of an ego, you think, I'm like Nehemiah. I'm like Nehemiah. I would love to be, a hero. I would love to take control like that and fix things up and just do the right thing and make things right. That would, identify with Nehemiah, who's the hero of the story. And that's quite right. That's completely appropriate. But actually I want to say that thinking about the whole story of the Bible, it's not the first thing you should think of. And that in this story, it would be better to think of yourself as a person living in the rubble. A person living in the burned city that has been destroyed, trying to live your life in that situation of disgrace and trouble. Disgrace and trouble. Because what is this story about, and what is the story of Jesus about? It's about people being rescued from their situation who are unable to help themselves. The people there in the city couldn't do it themselves. They needed someone to come in from the outside, someone with a particular authority and gifts to fix the situation. And that is what God does for us in Jesus, through Jesus. It'd be good just to think about that issue of disgrace, of people in disgrace. And I think this is probably not a term that we use that often to talk about the human problem, but disgrace is actually a good word to describe it. That our situation with God, the situation of humanity in the world, is one of disgrace. It's one of shame. That what we've done actually is so bad that we should feel ashamed for it, but we certainly are in a state of shame, a state of disgrace with God. So I wonder if you can kind of connect with that idea of disgrace. Let me tell you one of my disgrace stories. It's old enough now that I think I've just about got over it, right? So when I was about 5 or 6 old. This is the first time I'm telling this story. When I was 5 or 6 years old, I went to school for the first time, and some of the boys in my class, they dared me to spit at this girl in the playground. And being the idiot that I am, I thought it was a good idea, right? So I went and I tried to spit at her. Fortunately, I couldn't spit, but I tried to spit at her, right? And she luckily didn't spit on her, but she went and told one of the teachers, not my teacher, but another teacher in the playground. And she was the teacher of a 2nd or 3rd year class, so the big kids, like 7 or 8 year olds. And she made me go into her classroom at the end of lunch and spit in the sink, I don't know, for half an hour. Right, this is the punishment. And I was there, and I just remember, and there was this class of 7 and 8 year olds, big kids, watching me at the sink, spitting into it for half an hour. Right. And I just remember the shame. Now look, I hasten to point out, although this is a bit tough, I completely deserved it, and I have not spat on anyone since. Right, so it worked. But I just remember the burning shame of being in front of those. I had done the wrong thing, I deserved that, and I was in shame. It wasn't just that I was in the wrong, but I was ashamed of what I'd done, and I was being shamed. And it's that kind of situation that we are in with God. That the problem that we have with God is not just a problem of kind of cold justice, but of the heat of shame. The feeling that you have done wrong by a person, not just by a system. And that is the situation that we're in. And God sends Jesus to rescue us from our shame in a similar way to Nehemiah. So Nehemiah cared for the situation of the people of Israel in Jerusalem, and Jesus cared for our situation in the world. He shows compassion. He makes it his problem. And he comes as a servant to fix the problem. He comes as God's servant to deal with the problem. But unlike Nehemiah, he doesn't just risk death. He actually dies for us. And what Jesus does in his death is he takes on the disgrace. Jesus dies a death which is a public disgrace. He experiences that kind of disgrace for our sake. And Jesus' mission is more radical in the sense that Nehemiah came and he was a catalyst for fixing the problem. He had other people join him in fixing the problem. But Jesus comes and others actually ultimately fail to join him. Jesus fixes the problem on his own. He endures the shame of the cross on his own so that we could be set free from it. And so the Bible says, actually, whoever puts their trust in Jesus will never be put to shame. If you belong to God through Jesus Christ, you've been set free from your shame. You're now fully acceptable in God's sight. There is no shame anymore because Jesus has taken it away. And so as we read the story, I think it's first of all important that we think of ourselves like the people of Israel among the rubble, in trouble and disgrace. And only then, once you've kind of grasped that, I think to then say, okay, well, how could I be like Nehemiah today? How could I be like Nehemiah today? And I hope that you will. I hope that you will take responsibility for the situation. That you might take responsibility for the situation of God's people here at Melbourne Uni. That you might be someone who says, I'm going to act, yes, but I'm also going to pray first and ask God to bless what we're doing, what we're trying to do, and then act in ways that are self-giving and self-sacrificing for the good of other people, to see what it is that needs to be done and help to make it happen. And we're going to see more about the way Nehemiah does that in coming weeks. Why don't I pray? And if you want to ask any questions, then you can do that. Let's pray. Heavenly Father, we thank you so much that you do send saviours for your people, and we thank you most of all for Jesus, your Son. We thank you for rescuing us from our disgrace and our trouble. And we ask that you would please help us to welcome and accept and rejoice in your rescue. That you would help us to remember that you are the Saviour God, and that you would help us to see ourselves more and more as your servants in this world, like Nehemiah. And we pray this in Jesus' name. Amen. Would you like to ask any questions? That's a pretty super quick tour of the whole Bible and Nehemiah 1 and 2.
How do you respond to some people who don't necessarily feel ashamed for what they do?
Yeah, and I think, there's the subjective feeling of shame, which can actually be good sometimes, if you've got reason to be ashamed. Yeah, so there is the objective state of being, that you should be ashamed, and then there's the... Yeah, I don't know that you need to make people feel ashamed. Because I think that the shame that human beings have before God is deeply suppressed. It's there in people's lives. It's just pushed down. And so I think that you can talk about what God has done, even if people on the surface are not quite sure they think that way. Yeah. And I think shame is not a big deal for a lot of people in individualistic society, and we've talked about how pleasure and pain is often the main thing now, but I still think we get shame, and people are getting shamed all the time, and that's one of the great things about social media, is it's so easy to shame people. Yeah. So I don't think shame has gone away. Yeah.
About the 5 steps of Nehemiah's response.
Yeah.
I suppose 2 questions, but depending on the first answer. So,
yes.
Does it have to operate in that order? From caring, praying, asking, going, speaking, to speaking and starting?
No, I don't think so, but I think there is a logic to it. That you wouldn't pray if you didn't care, kind of thing.
Which is exactly my question. Can you pray for something that you don't particularly care for?
Yeah, I think that you can certainly grow in your passion for something by praying for it. Yeah, but with Nehemiah, the passion seems to be there, and it drives him to prayer. And even though he's a super activist, like he just gets stuff done, he still prays first, and that's really good for us to see, because many of us are activists, and we forget to pray. We forget that it's really in God's hands. So we notice it in Nehemiah, notice it in Jesus' ministry as well, that praying comes first. Okay, so more Nehemiah and the building of the walls next week.